This story that we're going to cover in this podcast episode is one that you would enjoy listening to, but definitely not enjoy it if it happened to you.
Yeah, if you can learn from my mistake on this one, it'll be much better for you.
So Steve's going to start telling the story because even though it happened to both of us because we're married, it impacted, I would say, you the most, correct?
Yeah, 100%.
So this is still an ongoing matter, even though without revealing too much about the story, we did succeed. But I guess I'll just hand it off to you to start off the story.
Yes, I guess we'll frame it up. So we have probably been through about 7 or 8 years in business at this time. Stacking savings, so that we could execute on some business opportunity that would come about, or if we wanted to go a little bit more conservative, we'd potentially go buy a house. And so I was actually leaning to the whole go do the house thing. And I guess partly my thinking at the time was, well, if I can just push a whole bunch of capital into a house, leave enough capital to run the businesses, it would give me a decent level of certainty. I would kind of know that a lot of the work that we've done was going to have sort of like a guaranteed result. It was going to help significantly. And so I was actually starting to be a little bit more conservative, which is not generally my approach to life. Being an entrepreneur, I generally have a little bit more of a risk or an appetite for risk than most people. And so I was actually at the stage where I'm like, okay, let's just throw this money into a house and we'll look at what other business opportunities exist that require a little bit less capital because we're going to shift capital here. And so we were actually in a position, we live in Glenmore Park, and I was going to essentially place money down on a house in Glenmore Park. And we, at the time, were able to put 50% down on the house. So just straight off cover 50% of the cost of the house, which would have put us obviously in a pretty decent position. And the overheads of living would have been, pretty low, for the future. And so right around that time, I had this other business opportunity present itself. And it was definitely the type of opportunity that I had been waiting for. I was stacking capital for something that I could pull the trigger on that, the barrier to this particular business was capital. It was the thing that gave you the opportunity to even play in this space. And so it was a car exporting business. And essentially what was happening, there was 2 partners, and one was in Papua New Guinea and one was in Australia. And I had met the guy from Papua New Guinea previously through our church network and whatnot. Didn't really know him personally, but had had a few conversations with him and, he was a pretty switched on business guy, or so it seemed. And the Australian guy I had never really met, but, they were operating in this business where they would buy cars from the auctions, they would fix them up, and then they would send them back to PNG. The Australian partner had actually done it to quite a few other developing countries as well. And so essentially these developing countries have a high demand for utility vehicles and very low supply. And despite what you might think about developing countries, there is a fair bit of money involved in them because they're growing. And so their need for utility vehicles was high. The business made sense. And generally speaking, you could buy a car at auction, fix it up, send it over, and there could be anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000 profit per vehicle after all is said and done. And so the model, extremely attractive. Got high demand, there's high levels of profit. The timeframes on which you should be able to produce this profit are relatively good. It seemed like an attractive business opportunity. And so I wasn't actually a part of the business. I was just coming in to offer capital initially via issuing short-term loans. So not that I'm a loan shark, but that's essentially the sort of situation. The banks were never going to give a loan to this style of business. And so you do peer-to-peer lending. I wrote the contracts. They were decent enough contracts. And that's how this sort of process started. So the first loan was for something like $30,000. It was repaid within 4 or 5 days. Now, for this particular business, there were sort of 2 issues that they really needed capital for. One was the PNG currency can't easily be bought and sold. You can't send a whole bunch of money offshore. There are only certain timeframes you can do it in, only up to certain amounts, and quite often there has to be some form of like a foreign exchange arbitrage to make the sort of situation work smoothly. And so access to funds and getting funds over was one of the restraints. The other one was these cars were in auctions, and so auctions have timeframes, and so you would often need to clear an auction quite quickly. And so if there's an opportunity that presents itself, this is a car that's going to be in high demand, very fixable, it's a good opportunity to pounce on. Now, really, they should have been having orders for all of these cars before purchasing at the auctions, but the probability that was someone that was going to buy these cars was quite high, whether they had an order for it or not. So, as I said, first loan was issued, they paid it back in 4 or 5 days. I ended up sort of issuing loans to the amount of about 100,000 quite quickly, and within a very short time frame, 4 to 6 weeks, the 100,000 was returned with interest. And so I was like, this is a positive business. Like, it's cash flowing, it's healthy. And I kind of thought, you know what, like, this could be something that I could definitely get involved in later. But, you know, I understand the current role I'm going to be playing is just in the issuing of loans and attaching interest to it. And so I decided not to put the money down on the house. I ended up investing more in the issuing of short-term loans. And it ended up being to the amount of somewhere around 400,000. The house that we were going to be buying was about 800,000 at the time. This was right before the boom, which really annoys me now, because if I would have put the 50% down, these houses are now worth 1.2, 1.3 conservatively. And it's in an area that we really like as well. Like, we go for walks regularly around that area now.
And this business, you offering short-term loans with interest attached, was going well for quite a few months.
Yeah, and you know, you're producing something like $1,500 profit roughly on a bi-weekly basis. So it was cash flowing well. And so if the model was decent, if it would have been run well, it still could be a decent model for people. But yes, essentially I ended up writing that many loans out. Often, like, I understand the immediate thing is, well, how on earth do you like issue that amount of money out? Like, you've got to be an idiot, right? Well, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but the cost of the car is significant. And so as much as it's a large amount of money, that's what I also believe the barrier to this particular business was. And so the time you've bought a few cars, it's very easy to like rack up that sort of amount of money. But it also meant that you could be capitalizing on many potential opportunities, because if a good vehicle comes up that's in high demand, it's, you know, it's a high probability you can make money off this situation. And so that was the way that the whole sort of system was currently working. Now, the Australian partner, who I ended up having to go to court with, because that was who the loans were issued with, essentially he got to a place where he had bought so many cars and wasn't able to fix any one car fast enough that it could go overseas, have the initial costs and the profits returned, and the business could keep running. So he dried up the cash flow by trying to jump on too many vehicles. And so a lot of the loans that I had issued were for particular vehicles, but they ended up funding the purchase of vehicles that didn't have orders placed for them.
Bad operator.
Yeah, essentially it's poor operation. But I wasn't involved in the business, so I couldn't just action things the way that I wanted to. And so when I came to the guy, you know, I'm a pretty nice person to work with usually. But eventually I got to the stage where I'm just like, mate, like, you need to sell the vehicles that don't have orders currently, you know, pending, so that we can put the money back into the system, stop the cash flow restraint, and start bringing profits back in and get this like thing spinning again.
Before that stage, you had issued loans and you weren't getting them paid back, and then they were asking for more loans. So that's what raised the question, how come these cars aren't getting processed like all the other months that had gone? Yeah,
and I guess, like, you know, under the guise of jumping on opportunities of vehicles coming up, that's what kind of made me think, okay, like, this is very like probable. And I went to like the I guess location where all the vehicles were held. I could see the vehicles, I could see them being worked on. You know, it wasn't like this business just didn't exist and that I was writing loans for an imaginary thing.
And in your mind as well, you would think, oh, well, we've got an asset, a car, we can sell those and get our costs back as well. So it's not like the money was gone, it was in assets.
Yeah, like minimizing your risk. Like, if you go buy a whole bunch of protein for a store, if you need to liquidate that stock quickly, you can easily liquidate it for your cost price and you minimize your downside risk. That should have still been on the cards. However, it wasn't. I had even proposed a way of selling these vehicles off that would allow the business to keep running, that would allow him to have way more than what he started with, and the business could keep operating and I could extract what I'd put out. Because there was about 35 cars at one point, and it should have been very easy to liquidate some of these cars that didn't have orders, return the capital to me, and they could have kept going with it. But he essentially turned around and said, no, the cars are mine. I might owe you the money, but the vehicles are mine, and I'm going to run this. This is my show. That's essentially what happened.
Very strange, just changing from a very well operated business to,
or at least one that had potential. And so I said, well, you can either go ahead with the plan that I proposed, and I was offering a decent level of flexibility there. Even to the point where I had helped this guy with petrol fees, paying his employees, when he had dried up cash flow. I was genuinely trying to help. But I essentially said to him, look, if you're not going to do this, I'm just going to take you to court. Now, this is the first time that I had ever needed to go to court. Generally speaking, I'm not in business with people that, these sort of situations are going to arise. And that was the issue. I wasn't in the business. I was just offering capital. And so we went to court. And for any of business owners that haven't experienced this yet, if you end up experiencing it, get information from people that have gone through the process so they can kind of set the expectations of what you're likely going to go through. Because I think that's one of the things that creates the greatest level of disappointment. When we, from my perspective, I had a loan, I had transaction history, I had records of communication, I had all of this. To me, that's a slam dunk case. You don't have a case against it. It is what it is. And it took a year and a half, essentially, for a decision to even be made. And I understand why he wasn't actually afraid of going through the court system, because he was, I think, very familiar with the court system. And he essentially just, delayed in so many different ways. He pulled the mental health card, and yes, it was pulling the mental health card, because he ended up going to a psychologist on court orders, and the psychologist said, no, he's completely fine. And, there was times where, I've got a doctor's certificate, I've got this, I've got that. It kept delaying it, essentially so that he could either keep running the business, which I hope is the case, as I said, it's an ongoing matter, or to hide the assets. But essentially, it wasn't a good sort of scenario. There's high amounts of stress, high amounts of pressure. And I essentially decided to go down the court system because I wanted to do the right thing. There were so many people inside my network, working in Western Sydney long enough, that said, hey, we'll sort this issue out for you. It's not a problem. We'll get it solved. You don't need to go to court, mate. It's all good. Anything from, hey, mate, $5,000. Hey, mate, 20 grand. We'll have this sorted in 48 hours to, hey, man, we're happy to help you for free type thing. You just let us know. And in my mind, that was actually probably the greatest probability of success. I mean, objectively speaking, I talked to a police officer and they had essentially said, in your current situation, with the level of involvement that you're talking about, the chances of you actually getting into any serious trouble is extremely small. I even went and talked to the lawyer and he's like, look, mate, the court system is not great at dealing with civil liabilities and actually having the people that are the victims get any sort of level of success with a probable sort of outcome. And so I had a police officer, a lawyer, a whole bunch of people willing to do it for free, a whole bunch of very compelling people that were just asking for a small price. And they were saying, look, this is what you need to do here. The court system's not good. And as much as I believed them, what they were saying was correct, and I actually held the point of view, this is the way that I should deal with this matter. The one thing that I was really sort of hesitant about was, because me and T are Christians, I know that I'm ultimately responsible before God for my actions. And the essence of this issue was, are you going to place the money that's involved with this particular situation above doing what's right before God? And that was an extremely hard thing to answer, even though it really shouldn't be when you think about it. But that's essentially what I was dealing with. The probability of going down the wrong pathway here was absolutely the best way to go on paper. The repercussions were small, the probability of success was high. When I started to really think about it though, and really got challenged with it, it was, the scripture that came to me was, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And that is something I genuinely have. It's a healthy fear of God. To openly defy essentially your creator for the pursuit of some extra money when he's the one that gives it and he's the one that can take it away, it's a pretty heavy thing that you're dealing with. Now, I may have made the right decision based on my own beliefs here, but that doesn't mean I'm now void from the consequences. Just because I trust God with the situation, it doesn't now mean then I get the solution that I want. Usually you get the lesson you deserve. And so essentially over about a year and a half, I had a huge level of stress. Like it kind of felt like on a day-to-day basis, whatever I was going to do that day, it was not going to generate anywhere near the level of money that was potentially at risk right now. Like, how am I supposed to focus on pulling the trigger on these other sort of businesses that we're involved in when I've got something that's just massive in like comparison to it?
And this was a year and a half.
A year and a half before we even had the outcome. And so, yeah, we won the case. Obviously, there was no case against it. And so, there's probably around about $400,000 at risk. We ended up getting, the contracts and loans honored by the court system. Because he essentially said, I don't have a case, I accept what you've put forward. Only took a year and a half to do that. And so we were rewarded the case for something over like 500 grand. And as much as I should be jumping up and down with excitement, yeah, it's good. It should have been the outcome the whole time. But the enforcement of that order now is a completely different like kettle of fish. So as we said, it's an ongoing matter. And so, one day we might be throwing a party if it all gets sorted out. But I think the likelihood is I won't be throwing a party. And so it's a real thing. And so, yeah, looking back over that year and a half, I'd already had a few injuries. So I had a double hernia. It took me about 6, 7, 8 months to get back into the gym after that. I should have gone back a lot quicker, but I didn't. Ended up putting a little bit of weight on during that time. And then the very month that I went back, I ended up tearing my pec, doing some jiu-jitsu with my cousins. And my brother was the one that actually caused this issue. We're just mucking around. Christmas morning, we're all playing around, and like that's when it happened. And so I had finally gone back to the gym, and now I'd torn my pec. And I had a really bad situation happen in hospital. When I got put under with the anesthetic, I ended up having an allergic reaction off the back of it. And at the time, I think you were running the Mighty Macro Kitchen and it was hectic in there, so I didn't really want to tell you anything about it. So I'd gone to hospital to have the operation. When I woke up, about 3 hours later, I started like convulsing and went into a fit because my body was just rejecting the anesthetic. And so the little like Filipino nurses could not like get me off the floor because they told me I needed to go to the bathroom. They're like, we need to check it off that you can go to the bathroom. So I walked over to the bathroom, ended up falling right into the wall, and none of them could get me off the floor. And so after having a double hernia operation, I had to get myself off the floor and then go back to bed. A couple of hours later, they said, hey, do you want to try again? I said, sure. They were like, hold on, let us get like an extra person. You can have one person on either shoulder so we can at least guide you to the bathroom. I was like, that sounds great. As soon as they walked out of the room, it might have just been the sitting up again. My body started rejecting whatever happened with the anesthetic again, and I went back into a fit. And again, they couldn't help me. And so it was a full thing. Like I didn't really want to go back in to get surgery after I had experienced that with the double hernia surgery. So I left it. What that meant was though, like I essentially couldn't lift anywhere near what I was doing before, and that was pretty demoralizing. So I was now in a position where I wasn't training because of my injury. I had a whole bunch of stress because of what was happening in the business world. And so I wasn't training regularly. I wasn't like eating healthy was a distant memory. And I ended up doing like half a bottle of whiskey pretty much every single night for an extended period of time.
When we spoke about that before we started recording, I didn't know that because at the time that was during COVID and I lost my taste and smell. So I couldn't smell that you were drinking whiskey in a cup.
Which also means I wasn't acting like an idiot
No,
around.
I didn't
like,
know.
I have like quite a few set rules. Like, you can kind of balance your own ideas on whether a Christian should be drinking or not. But for me, it was like, as long as I was not acting in a way that I wouldn't act sober, unless it was causing some sort of physical harm, making me talk in a certain way. If there was like some overt sort of what we would call sin coming off the back of it, 100% I would think it was negative, but that just wasn't the case. It was more just dulling the noise that was in the head because on a good day, I've got an overactive mind. Combined with all the stress that was there, the overactive mind wasn't helping too much. And so it was something that just essentially helped me relax. And I know most people are going to go, mate, you're an alcoholic, you just don't know it. But I was actually listening to Alex Hormozy, who was talking about this the other day, which kind of helped because I think entrepreneurs can often have quite similar DNA, quite similar thought patterns. And he was saying he actually went through a very similar business situation where he got ripped off by a business partner. The guy essentially just took the money from the account and was like, oh, this is my half. And it was all of it. And so he explained he was doing half a bottle of Johnny Walker during the time when he was with Layla. And it's funny, like I would have said the same thing. I could have stopped at any moment. It's just I would have preferred to be quietening the noise down. And it's true. At any point in time that I've ever tried to stop, I can just stop for a month. Just don't need it. I also understand inside the people that have been like, well, actually, first of all, the first part of Alcoholics Anonymous is you need to identify that you've got a problem. And second of all, just because you can stop for a period of time doesn't mean that you're an alcoholic. I get it. I understand it. But all I can say is I can quite easily stop whenever I want to. Whether I have it or not is not a massive issue. This was essentially just a coping mechanism. And the real part to it is I shouldn't have been relying on something to calm my head down. If I was trusting in God, that's where the peace should be coming from. But that was the case. And, after an extended period of time of drinking relatively regularly, you're actually ingesting quite a few calories by doing that. And as I said, I wasn't eating healthy. And so I ended up putting on about 15 kilos off the back of that. And so made my way up to about 125 kilos. Now, I've got to say, I was never overly depressed or really upset about that.
No one really knew because at the same time you were opening a new supplement store location, we were growing Mighty Macro Meals, and you were dealing with the stress and management of both those businesses.
Yeah, I was still performing. That was one of the other things. If I was drinking and I wasn't getting up the next day, that's a bit of an issue. But I was still performing all in the same ways. Yeah, I wasn't training at the gym and I didn't look the part, but at that time I wasn't even serving people inside a supplement store. And so, people can tell that you've put on a decent amount of weight. And some people said things and some people didn't, but I wasn't really worried about it. I was pretty happy overall. I wasn't kind of in a depressed state. It wasn't like that. But yeah, I had to eat the stress up that was involved. And so I think I'm back down to about 112, 113 now. And if I chill at 105, I'm pretty happy with that. And so there are a lot healthier sort of food choices. And now I'm kind of trying to optimize my lifestyle, despite, the stress that still continues, more for business performance. So I'm fasting for generally the first half of the day, putting in nootropics, keeping hydrated, relying on caffeine a little bit, but, to kind of curb the hunger. And that's kind of the way that I'm doing things. I'm just optimizing for business performance in terms of what I do for training, because I wouldn't call it training. It's like exercise. I go to the gym and pretend that I'm lifting weights, but it's just about being in the routine, eating a little bit more healthy, and taking more a brain fuel focus approach to what I'm doing now. But yeah, that was the situation that I got into, and it was, relatively stressful. Got a few gray hairs off the back of it. And, I've learned a few business lessons, but I think the lessons that I really learned, which were the most valuable, were the personal lessons. It's I've seen, breakups happen over very small amounts of money inside relationships. And to have T know that $400,000+ is up for grabs here, the chance of you getting it back is relatively minimal. You could imagine that, having a wife that is supportive is going to be extremely influential to how your sort of actions pan out off the back of being a part of a situation like that. And so there wasn't a moment where you swayed in your love for me, in the way that you talked to me, in the way that you acted towards me. You hadn't lost respect for me. That so many of these things that, as much as I would have thought it would be true, you don't know it until you're actually in it. And for me to know that I've got a wife, whether I succeed or whether I lose, is going to act and love me in the exact same way is a pretty massive thing. I get to hold on to that for life. And I don't get to have it just as a theory. There's something I expect to happen, something we've talked about, and that would happen. It's no, you've been right in the middle of it and you experienced, there was no difference in that. Now, there wasn't much sympathy that came from you because it's generally not the way that we operate with each other. It was more just well, mate, there's no point crying over spilled milk, do what you need to do type thing. And that was, I think exactly the way that you should have handled me. Not that you're handling me, but the way that you should have acted towards me. Because off the back of it, after I decided to stop feeling like woe is me, I opened up or essentially initiated the start of 2 other businesses during that time, which have both been quite beneficial. And so it was more you can continue to, look at what you've lost, or you can get back on track and start to put runs on the board again. And I think understanding the timeframes that are associated with my life, being I'm young in my business sort of experience, and I guess I've got a lot of years ahead. And so what we've accomplished in the last 6, 7, 8 years, I think has been really cool. But I've got another 30 ahead of me. And so the more experience I have, and when I have more capital to throw at like new business opportunities, the chances that I can get those results or greater in a smaller amount of time is high. And the fact that I can now identify opportunities with a heightened level of caution around risk and understanding where risks might come from is extremely valuable. And so, yeah, it's interesting, looking in hindsight, and I would prefer none of it happened, but the actual personal lessons that I've taken from it are more important than the business lessons I've learned from it. And I would actually say the fact that I think I've learned lessons about my relationship with God and my relationship with my wife, I would pay the price knowing what those lessons now mean to me. They're core principles that like I hold and have added a strength to my character that I couldn't have just obtained through the knowledge, of someone else telling me or reading about it. I still would choose not to go through it again if it was on the cards, but if it was the only way that I could gain those lessons, then I would go through it again, because I think I'm much more concerned with the person that I become in business rather than how much money I make, and how I make my money actually does mean something to me. But as for the business lessons, which is, I assume, why most people would be listening, there was one that really stood out well to me. And I've actually used it in helping people actually analyze whether a business that they're looking to acquire is something that they should be doing or not. And the particular business lesson I learned is actually really applicable to that particular space. When you're buying another business, one of the lessons I learned was really important. And that lesson is how concentrated the income is for a given business. So just to use easy numbers, if 80% of your income comes from 30% of your clientele, if you go and acquire that business and you don't facilitate that 30% that generates 80% of the results, there is a massive risk that lies in that business. If you don't have contracts that are going to get passed over, the introduction from the previous business owner to increase the probability that they stay on, if you don't have a service or a product offering that's superior to what the old business owner was offering, that gives you a really good chance of maintaining those people, the risk can be much larger when acquiring a new business if there is concentrated income. So the 30% that may be generating 80% of the revenue, if 15%, half of that 30% leave, imagine what that's going to do to the 80% of income that's coming into that business. So forecasting the likelihood of probable profit and probable success in a business can be heavily dependent on how concentrated that income is. And so it was funny, my dad ended up calling me and said, oh, look, within our business, we're looking to take on a sort of mobile service here. What are some of the considerations that you would make? And he's been in business for a very long time, has a lot of experience. And so this is a thought pattern. It's a business consideration that is detailed. It's you only learn this usually off the back of coming out of an experience like this. And I won't go into explain how I learned that business lesson from my experience, but it's been extremely helpful. And it's also something that I now look to diversify in. If I can diversify the risk, how spread out is the income that's being generated? How many different types of sources can I increase income from, so I'm not heavily dependent on one portion of clientele? It's something I'll look to do. And so I had another person call up and they were looking at acquiring a plumbing business. And the guy wanted something like 750 grand for the business. It's a significant amount. And the business was probably generating 400 grand profit a year. And so, an acceptable business valuation is generally 2 years times annual profit. And on paper, that looks great. However, the consideration for both the X factor of the business, how much the business owner operator actually brings in, what's the influence that they have on that business's ability to generate profit, and how concentrated that income is, are two things that aren't easily quantifiable, but they're absolutely things that you should be looking in at, because that business, the projected forecasted profits that it's likely going to be able to generate, is heavily dependent on how concentrated that income is. You lose the wrong type of clients, and the probability of that business's success or continued profit at that level can completely change. And so that is something that's I think an important business lesson to learn, and it came off the back of it. And I extracted a whole bunch of other lessons that had sort of come from that experience. And so it wasn't like it was I guess a mistake without some genuine sort of lessons that I can now use.
There's another venture that I think we'll share once it comes to market. Mm-hmm. I can't say anything more. But one of the things that you've learned from this story is that you do your due diligence on people's personal finances, so like checks.
Yeah. So previously, I wouldn't have looked at the personal income or liabilities or personal factors that existed with a particular person. I would have just said, what are you bringing to the business, and analyze the risk that would be then associated with that sort of situation. Now, I don't care whether it's like normal business procedure to be asking to look at someone's personal financials. I'll do it now, because the risk profile to me completely changes depending on that person's personal circumstances. And if they don't want to offer that level of transparency, that's cool. Like, find someone else to do business with. But that's something that I'm way more cautious about now. And I also understand, well, that's why banks have such high levels of filtering processes, because there's so many variables that occur in people's personal lives that can influence their ability to, produce a predictable result. And so, it was an interesting scenario. As I said, it's still like a sort of an ongoing matter, and hopefully we'll have something to celebrate. Maybe we'll update you, maybe we won't. We generally don't share too much of our personal lives, but if this does help someone, if you're someone that ends up facing a potential civil case, off the back of being in business, feel free to reach out. At a minimum, hopefully I can offer some insights. At a maximum, maybe I can refer you to the right people to talk to. But yeah, it's been an interesting set of, what would you say? An interesting set of circumstances that's kind of led us to our sort of current position.
Yeah, I think of it as it's for the plot.
It's for the plot. It's for the story. I think we've essentially given people some insights of, I guess, the challenges that can come with business. And so, we're pretty transparent with this sort of stuff. I would rather project an accurate depiction of where we are at, the sort of space that we play in as small business owners, rather than, just putting up a highlight reel of wins on social media. So, if it helps people, that's our intention. And there is like a saying that I really do like, and it's smooth seas never created a skilled sailor. And so I think people that have experienced challenges in business, not that you need to, because I do believe there are people that can offer huge amounts of insights and valuable information that don't necessarily go through many challenges themselves. It doesn't mean the information, is not credible. But I think for people that do go through circumstances, there is a layer of context that they can sort of apply to decision-making processes that can be greater. And so, I resonate with that particular quote. I don't think that one's a cliche. And so, having the challenges in business that help develop us, help develop character, help give business insights and a sort of a framework that's a little bit different than, things if they've always been smooth, I think is something that's valuable in business.
Another good story for the podcast. And there's many more stories, because we haven't even covered all of the businesses that we've been a part of, all the different ventures that you've been a part of. I'm really excited for the rest of our podcast episodes. So I think we'll leave this one here, and we'll chat to you guys in the next episode.
Sounds good.
Cut.